Well, good evening. Very good of you to come tonight, and thank you, Verlein, for for your kind welcome and for your collegial looking after me. It's much appreciated. I see this evening not so much as an academic exercise. Rather, I wanted to have the privilege of talking with you and exploring with you what on earth Christians might mean by salvation. So I don't have the answer in my pocket, but I have a few suggestions how we could approach that question and learn from the tradition, learn from the past, but also learn from contemporary discussions. I'm a Roman Catholic, so I will take a number of examples from the Roman Catholic Church, but not exclusively, so I'll think salvation concerns all Christians, and my interest is to have a broader Christian conversation and to invite you into this. I feel always very ambiguous coming to another culture and another country and exporting, so to speak, the debate which in this case we have in Oxford. But forgive me for doing this. This is my ticket to hear what you have to say. And that's the only way I can come into a conversation, by traveling. So this is my labor of love to enter the conversation with you, not to bombard you with what people think in other parts of the world. I'm of course very interested in emerging and recovering Chinese Christianity, and I want to know how people here approach the questions which are also our questions. So maybe we have more universal questions than we have universal answers. Is that tempo okay? Can you follow me? Okay. I would like to start by asking the questions, why is there this desire to be saved, in this case among Christians? What do we want to be saved from? And what do we want to be saved for? So what is that which inspires the Christian longing of salvation? In 1968, so almost 50 years ago, just before he died, the then very famous Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth was asked by a television crew, do you expect to see your loved ones after your death? And Karl Barth answered, I'm afraid not only my loved ones. So what he meant by this is that his hope for what happens after death in eternal life was to be not only reunited with the ones you love, but even with the ones you hate, or you couldn't care for, couldn't care less for. So I think what he showed in this brief episode is maybe we should reconsider what we really hope for. Because if heaven, after all, is when we meet the ones we want to get rid of already at this point, maybe heaven is not such a good thing after all. So what is it, what we desire? And are we only desiring something for ourselves or for myself? Or is part and parcel of my desire also to meet otherness even beyond this life? I think that's an important question, which he gave this very cheeky answer to. A second consideration, again from my home country, Germany, the famous 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once remarked, Christians cannot really look forward too much to their salvation, otherwise they would look happier. But their faces are often so unhappy that you would find it difficult to believe that they actually are excited by what is ahead of them. Feuerbach and others put it differently, but I think this question is an important one. Do Christians, I include myself, do we Christians radiate joy about being saved? Or don't we? So why do we talk about it if we don't like it? Or to put it more brutally, is salvation something we are afraid of? Or something we're looking forward to? It's interesting today that so seldom are we talking about this issue of salvation? When I was a student in Chicago, which was a lie mentioned 40 years ago, I was shocked coming from Germany to America, the Midwest, when suddenly people in the house, a Christian house I stayed with, said to me, when did Jesus become your personal savior? For me as a Catholic, this was a very unusual question, and I didn't know what to answer. And I said, well, I've always been a Christian. Well, that's not what I want to know, my friend said to me. I said, well, what do you want to know? He said, when is the moment in which you accepted salvation? I said, there is no such moment. I'm a boring Christian. There's no such moment in my life. I've always been part of the church and part of a Christian family and praying. And in that sense, I've always been hoping for that culmination of love in God's relationship to me. And so there's not one moment like Paul's conversion to Damascus. So in my life, I couldn't really satisfy my housemate's curiosity. And he thought I was a very strange Christian because I couldn't name the moment. And he taught me an important lesson. He taught me that salvation may be more than one thing, more than what I've learned in my catechesis as a young child. And to put it even more bluntly, allow me, this is a thought experiment, to say, are we really looking for salvation or are we looking for reconciliation? I just want to play with those two terms. I'm not playing them against each other. I just want to use this in order to move the argument forward. It's interesting that, as a colleague of mine once wrote, few words proper to Christianity's core vocabulary have at present the less defined meaning than the word salvation. It could mean all kinds of things. I'll come back to this. But there's a wide spectrum, and I like to explore that spectrum. For some people, salvation is a very individualistic concern, like for my friend in Chicago. What does it mean to me? How can I be saved? On the opposite extreme, you have how can we together be saved? So a communitarian aspect. But you have even people who say the point is not human salvation, the point is the salvation of the ecosystem. And the ones who messed it up are the humans, so that the ecosystem can only be saved if human life is extinguished. All this is salvation. So whose salvation for whom? Many people, especially from around the time of St. Augustine, that means 4th, 5th century to the time of the Reformation, 16th century, were very much concerned how I can be saved in spite of my sins. How can I be saved from sin and death, even eternal death? The young Martin Luther, whom we celebrate this year because it's 500 years since his reformational breakthrough, he was obsessed with that question. So obsessed that he wanted to become a full-time salvation figure and joined a monastery at the time in order to deal day and night with this question until he understood that this may have been the wrong starting point. I'll come back to him later. But for him, the point was, how can I be saved from eternal damnation? It was not for him the main point for young Luther, how can I be saved from death? Which then became a rather important question, especially in the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modernity and post-modernity, when we almost find it an incredible mistake of evolution that we actually die. And in case you don't believe me, in the plane coming here, I flew from Sweden, Finland, via Helsinki to Hong Kong. I was reading a Swedish daily newspaper, one of the biggest daily newspapers in Sweden, when 13 international doctors said that our fight, the enemy of medicine, is death. We have to overcome death, and we want the European community and other bodies to give us extra research money so that we can deal with death once and for all. This is rather peculiar to read this, that for them the salvation would be to get rid of death, which any evolutionary biologist can tell you is a rather far-fetched interest, but not really a very good one. So the question is death part of the human condition, or does salvation mean to get rid of death? You see, there's a large spectrum of what we have to deal with here today. Of course, if you look at the biblical material, you find issues of salvation in all the biblical genres. The Hebrew scriptures calling on God to save them from persecution, to save them from their Babylonian captivity, to save them from Egyptian oppression. So salvation was God's intervention in history for the benefit of Israel and God's people. But in the Psalms, you have a different tone which can have that one as well, but also added the personal dilemma of the human being confronted with illness, with death, not just personal death, but also death around them, death in the family, and so forth. And in the Gospels, when you read, Jesus' meeting with people who are ill, excluded, or in other ways looked down upon, like the tax collectors, in all of these cases, salvation meant something rather immediate. For Jesus, salvation in this meeting with people meant to bring them back into a communication with God, with each other, with themselves, but also with the people of Israel at large. And yet, in the New Testament, as time shifts and after the death of Jesus, salvation moved more and more to the future. Now, while Mark's gospel, like no other gospel really, has this immediacy, the kingdom of God is at hand, in the later letters, you have the kingdom of God as something to await. So salvation become more a future issue than a present issue. And then throughout church history, you have this effort to bring it back to the present, or to delegate it to the future. So that's another issue. Salvation, when? Is salvation only to be part of the next life, or the afterlife, as we call it, for want of a better word, or is salvation something which could already begin now? And then you have another added dimension in the church in 1302, so this is 700 plus years, Pope Boniface VIII solemnly declared that every human being wishing to attain salvation needs to be subordinate to the Roman Pontiff. So in other words, salvation is only possible if the Pope administers it through the bishops and priests. So here you have the church suddenly becoming as the vehicle or the interlocutor, whatever way you want to put it, of salvation. Salvation was not something between God and people, but it was something between God, church, authority, and people. So salvation was not only removed to the future, but it was also removed administratively. A bit, when you see the, that's when I thought about it last year when I went to Beijing and walked into the Forbidden City, all the steps up, this is a bit like salvation was understood in the 14th and 15th century. That's something with many intermediaries you have to move up to, figuratively speaking. And then you have another aspect. Why do we need to be saved at all? What has gone wrong with God's creation? Was creation bad? So that you need to undo it, or undo the damage of it. How do creation and salvation relate to each other? Well, you have two contradictory arguments in the mainline Christian tradition. Augustine, who was Bishop of Carthage in North Africa, many Europeans think he was a European bishop. That is nonsense. He died when he was 76 years old, and of those 76 years, he lived 5 in Europe. I have now lived 5 in Oxford, but this doesn't make me an Oxford man, nor is Augustine a European, but rather, interestingly enough, he's an African theologian. I think we should acknowledge that. He understood the world as basically depraved and fallen. So for him, salvation was to get out of the misery of this world. That has to do with his Gnostic youth. For those of you who don't know, Gnosticism was a competing religion with emerging Christianity and Judaism. arguing that this world isn't really real. The really real world is the one beyond. This is only bad shades, bad shadows, out of which we have to be saved by whatever mechanism. There were a number of those discussed. And young Augustine was part of this sect or religion or whatever movement. Interestingly enough, the Gnostics are the only ones who have a clear answer to the question of evil. And that appealed to Augustine. The Gnostics knew that evil happened because of an inner eternity thing gone wrong. So that the divinity or the creator of the world was a bad guy. That the world was an accident and it has to be undone. Now the tragedy of Augustine is that through him and a number of his fellow thinkers, in spite of their conversion from this to Christianity, this suspicion against creation has remained. Certainly in Catholicism and in Protestantism, which I know, it has remained that this world isn't really real, that the really world starts after this world. So that many Christians, Catholics and Protestants alike, have a suspicion that this world has really gone to the dogs. And therefore the only thing which is important is how we get out of this mess. And that this can either take an individualistic journey or it can take a corporate or communitarian journey. But the point of this Augustinian heritage is to get out of it. Or to say it in Augustine's own word, the New Jerusalem is not of this world, but it's one which only God can bring down. So we human beings are really not capable of properly executing this, helping to create this New Jerusalem. And also as a consequence, Augustine argued, when we talk about love, that human beings are not really capable of loving. When we love each other, it is God who loves in us. So God is the ultimate agent of love. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, though much influenced by Augustine, radically, however, disagreed with Augustine on 2 points. First of all, we are capable of love. We are even having or sharing a vocation to become friends of God. These are Thomas's own words. And secondly, God's creation is good. In spite of the sinfulness of human life and the crimes and the sins and all the evil which we are responsible for. But God's creation is good. So what we need for Thomas is not so much salvation from this world, than a reconciliation with God in this world. And Thomas, being a good philosopher, played with the word time and eternity. He says the measure of human life is time. We are conditioned by time. But the measure of God's life is eternity. And for Thomas, it was not that we have time now and then eternity. Rather, that in God's creation and in God's confirmation of creation in Jesus Christ, eternity is present in time. You see what he tried to do? He tried to say that we are not cut off from God or God's eternity. We don't have to wait to be taken out to somewhere else, but rather we are in the presence, however limited by space and time and language, we're in the presence of eternity already here and now. And the best witness for that is the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So for Thomas, the message is not that there are only a few elect who will be saved and everything else will be extinguished, as Augustine believed. He thought about 144,000 or so would be saved. As I took the MTR today, I was wondering, thinking about my lecture, how many that would be who would be saved. When in a busy Hong Kong evening of people going home from work, you have already more than 144,000. So there'd be nothing left for Germany, England, France, and so forth. Whereas for Thomas, this was not the issue. The issue was that everybody is the bearer of God's image, the imago Dei. And therefore everybody, every human being, not just Christians, every human being was invited to become a friend of God. And when you see how in the 12th and 13th century many Christian theologians had daily, we forget this, daily exchanges with their Jewish and their Muslim colleagues on these matters, you can see that when we today praise ourselves for our interreligious openness. This is cold coffee for Thomas Aquinas and Bernard of Clairvaux and Maimonides and Avicenna, whatever their names were at the time. They were all thinking about that. How can we live in God's eternity? So I think it's sometimes good to do history, not to believe only in what we think we should be doing. It's interesting that in Roman Catholic church practice and theology, especially since the Second Vatican Council, that means the last 50 years, the term reconciliation has gained more prominence. We even use that as the sacrament of reconciliation when we talk to what was before called the sacrament of penance. So the point, the shift, so to speak, through the Second Vatican Council was to recover this understanding of reconciliation. That in Jesus Christ, God has reconciled the world to himself. And therefore the issue was not to get out of this world as quickly as we can, like the Gnostics, because this is a bad joke, but to see that this world is the only world God has made. When I say world, I should say universe. This universe is or universes, maybe more, I don't know, but that this evolutionary process is the only one God has made, and therefore we are part of this and we are invited to participate in this. I think, so if we say it bluntly, should we be striving for salvation out of this evolutionary process? Or should we understand reconciliation as being properly in it? And what would that mean for our understanding of life, of death, of eternity, and so forth? So I think these are the questions which this question gives rise to. And as I promised you before, I will heap questions on questions. It's interesting that in his last but one encyclical letters, the present Pope, I have the English edition here with me, Laudatio Si, on care for our common home, voices similar thoughts, and I just should quote him verbatim. Disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor, for whose care and custody I'm responsible, ruins my relationship with my own self, with others, with God, and with the earth. When all these relationships are neglected, when justice no longer dwells in the land, the Bible tells us that life itself is endangered. We see this in the story of Noah, where God threatens to do away with humanity because of its constant failure to fulfill the requirements of justice and peace. And he quotes book of Genesis, chapter 6, I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And then the Pope continues, these ancient stories, full of symbolism, bear witness to a conviction which we today share, that everything is interconnected and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. So what you hear in this quote is this longing to bring a question, a concern for reconciliation back to the forefront of, in this case, Catholic or Christian thinking, but beyond. Because this text is not addressed to Catholics or Christians, this text is addressed to all people of goodwill, which I think is very interesting. So the Pope invites people to say, well, wait a moment. If any of our four defining relationships goes wrong, all go wrong. And this defining relationship is my relationship to God, to my fellow human beings, living and dead and future, to evolution, creation, the whole process, and the most difficult of them all, to myself. And he continues to argue in this text that if we neglect the poor, I'll give you one example, then all these relationships are in danger of losing the equilibrium. If we neglect our duty and responsibility to the earth, to the variety of plants and animals and the air, all these relationships are in danger. If we neglect justice, even justice to ourselves, then all this is in danger. So the point he tries to make is that reconciliation concerns the entire interconnected whole in which we find ourselves. So salvation, as we have seen it in the different ones, is too small a focus for this interconnected whole which we are confronted with and which we are called to participate in. So what we can see from the present Pope's efforts is to be radically non-dualistic. Non-dualistic in the sense of playing out a future world against this one. And he says this is the common home which God has made for us. This home we have to treasure. We have to be committed to. We have to help build up. We cannot just excuse ourselves and hope for an individual salvation out of this. You see, these are shifts, and also shifts as compared to Pope Boniface in 1302, whom I quoted, that everybody who has any hope for salvation has to go through papal administration. When the present Pope went to Lund in Sweden, the city I taught in and lived for many years, last 31st of October and 1st of November, he came there to say that Lutherans, in this case, and Catholics share a common responsibility for our common home. And he sees himself not as the one who vindicates only Catholicism, but who says we have to vindicate humanity together, all Christians and non-Christians together. That's why he addresses this book to everybody and not just to Catholics or Christians. So the spectrum of our concern of salvation is not just an inner Christian spectrum, but it is a spectrum which concerns all human beings. And that puts, I think, a few question marks to how we understand love as the love of God, the love of neighbor, the love of self, and the love of God's creation. For Thomas Aquinas, love was a theological virtue, as he called it. It seems like you have to get a PhD to acquire that. That's not what he meant. But he meant it's a virtue which God gives, like hope and faith. Those three virtues, love, hope, and faith, are gifts of God, or Protestants would call it graces of God, which are given to all human beings, whether they are aware of it or not. And it becomes a tragic misunderstanding of Reformation and anti-Reformation in the 16th and 17th century that love was a Christian possession or a Christian virtue alone. So that Christians alone had proper love, which the present Pope is eager to show is not the case. But for quite some time, up to certainly the Second Vatican Council and Protestant terminology about the same time, Christians believed that there was such a thing as Catholic love or Protestant love. And it's very interesting. I researched in my own studies when did this term Christian love appear for the first time. As I said, Thomas Aquinas would have not understood the term. Love was love, and love was from God. It was not a Christian thing. I think, and since we honor Martin Luther, we also have to say the ambiguities. I think he is the one who created that term. I found it twice in his writing. I haven't read them all, but the ones I found it twice. And one, significantly enough, in his writing against the Jews. When he was 60 years old, he was very disappointed with the Jews and felt that the Jews have not understood the mystery of Christian love, and therefore they should leave Germany and they should go somewhere else where they came from. They shouldn't be there because they're destroying the game, so to speak. He was very disappointed. He thought with some good arguments, which he gave 20 years previously, they should have become Christians themselves, and when they didn't, he was very upset. And to use the term Christian love as distinguishing himself from the Jews or the Turks. With Turks he meant the Muslim world. I think this is an interesting and important issue when we talk about salvation. If love is that desire, that motivation, that God-given virtue of relating properly to others, to God, to God's creation, to ourselves, we must make sure that we don't domesticate that too quickly, as we have done quite often in Christian thinking. That we see love as that which connects us with every human being of goodwill, to whom the Pope addresses his book. I agree with Thomas Aquinas and with Pope and even with Martin Luther, though with that caveat which I mentioned, that love is that power which we have been given to look into the present and the future in terms of God's fulfillment. It is that power to do works of reconciliation with human beings, with nature, with ourselves. And that love is that which in the Song of Songs and the Hebrew Scriptures is said to be as strong as death. It's interesting that you have this, it's chapter 8, verse 6, that you have death and love on a par. That death is that which limits our life in terms of space, language, and time. But love is that which unlimits our life in terms of eternity, in terms of already taking part into what God gives, as Thomas Aquinas put it, eternity already in the here and now. It's interesting, you see, when you compare the different texts on the resurrected Jesus in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles. When Jesus, the crucified, resurrected, appears, he appears not in terms of time, categories of time, space, and language which we can control. He appears at moments unexpected, like on the way to Emmaus, in this relational moment. He appears on mountains, he appears in closed rooms. In other words, the resurrected Christ is no longer submitted to the limitations of space, time, and language, which we are. And that's the only clue we have about God's eternity in the sense of what will happen after our death. That he is recognizable, he is caring, but he cannot be limited. I think this gives us some understanding, however mysterious, of what it means to become part of God's eternity. So far, we are limited by space, time, and language, and in death, this limit ceases. But it's interesting that in the resurrection stories, the relational quality of Jesus Christ, or of God in Jesus Christ, does not cease with death. So it is no longer bound to the conditions which we are bound to. I think that's about as much as we can say about what comes after death, because none of us can put ourselves into a situation of no longer being limited by space, time, and language. Immanuel Kant talked lots in his critique of pure reasons about space and time, but he forgot language, so we can add that. But those three categories define human life. And so when we talk about salvation, we don't mean that we are getting rid of these, but that in death we cease to be defined by them. And more we cannot say about what's happening to us in death. So when the Swedish and other researchers want to conquer death, I become very afraid that they want to limit me forever. And I don't think that is a good thing I'm longing for. So how should we then, in our daily lives, deal with love as that agent of eschatology? Eschatology is the doctrine of the last things, as the Catholic and Protestant theology calls it. So how should we see love as that agency which helps us to come into a properly reconciled relationship with God, each other, ourselves, and God's earth? I think it's important, again, to start with Pope Francis's encyclical letter, that we cannot have one without the other. We can only have, as he called it, an ecological totality. We cannot say we want to only commit ourselves to helping the poor not to be poor, if the price for that is to destroy the earth. We cannot just save the earth if this is ignoring the plight of the poor. We cannot just save the earth or the poor if we ignore the demands of justice. And an unjust love is no love. It's just injustice, and very selective version. So how can we deal with the demands of love in our present situation? And I just wanted to read you one last sentence from this text. This is our openness to others, each of whom is a thou, somebody you can address, capable of knowing, loving, and entering into dialogue. Our openness to others remains the source of our nobility as human persons. A correct relationship with the created world demands that we not weaken this social dimension of openness to others, much less the transcendent dimension of our openness to the thou of God, the otherness of God. Our relationship with the environment can never be isolated from our relationship with others and with God. Otherwise, it would be nothing more than romantic individualism dressed up in ecological garb, locking us into stifling immanence. So what he's trying to say there is that when we talk about that we want to be working in love for reconciliation, we have to be accepting that we are faced with this totality of human relationality, our relationship to others, other human beings, to nature at large in its evolutionary process, to God and to our own emerging selves. And we cannot have one without the other. That's why we have to be careful also that we don't fall into the trap of mere optimism in progress. You know, optimism is a degraded or reduced hope. It is the hope that everything will work in the system as we have it. Christian hope is not optimism. Christian hope is hope in transformation, in change. That we will be reconciled to what we should be and what we are made to be. And that this creation is the only creation which God has made and in which we are called to work with God for the good of all creation, including ourselves. I think that's very important, that love is not a love to get out of this world, but a love in this world. And that the creation and transformation of creation we are longing for is not sideways, but in the middle of this world. And that brings me to the last concept I want to mention. How do we imagine a reconciled world? Do we imagine this as a paradise which once lost figuratively by Adam and Eve, regained, so that we are really cyclically going back to the beginning, which human beings have messed up? Or do we hope, as I mentioned before, for a paradise without human beings, so that all nature will no longer be destroyed because we see ourselves as a liability for nature? Or do we look for something new? Nothing totally new, but new in the sense that this creation will come to its fulfillment in God's mysterious ways, which we cannot anticipate. But we have only inklings, we have only images to look forward to in that sense. Where do we stand? Where do you stand in this? What do you really hope for? To return to the beginnings, whatever they are? Augustine believed that, because we messed it up and therefore we have to go back to the beginning. Or do we believe in reconciliation, that it still can be made right, not by each one of us alone, but by us together with the help of the Holy Spirit? And it's very interesting if you look for a moment just in Catholic teaching. It's full of contradictions, even during the Vatican Council. You have both those images, to go back to the paradise lost, or to go forward to a new transformative reconciled creation. You have all this side by side in the Catholic Catechism of 1987, and you can pick and choose on which side you want to be, because all these contradictions are there and have been there throughout Christian history. But I firmly side with those who do not want to have a world without human beings, and I side with those who do not want to go back to a mythical beginning, but I side with those who want to move forward to a reconciled whole in which we all become as responsive and responsible for that vocation which each one of us bears in God's creative and reconciling process. I think it's interesting that in that process, and this brings me to conclusion, it is not enough for Christians just to look at their own Christian garden or their own Christian image of paradise. We have to have something which an Australian colleague, Anthony Kelly, once called an inter-hope dialogue. We have to, like we do today, that we get together and ask ourselves, what are our different hopes? How can we reconcile our hopes, or can we not? And what is it we hope for? To go back to a dualistic understanding, to go forward without human beings and hope that we all be extinguished sooner than after, which North Korea and others may help us in doing, or do we really long for a new relationship with God, each other, God's creation and evolution, and ourselves? I side firmly with this last horizon. You could say then, from that perspective, to conclude that love is the horizon in which Christians are invited to imagine God's coming reign. The sign of God's coming reign is love. But the love also of human beings, part and parcel of that. And in that sense, you can say with the German Jesuit Karl Werner, it's never too late to start loving. And he didn't mean any romanticizing or sentimentalizing, but it's never too late to enter this process of reconciliation in facing otherness, both within and outside, and facing the radical otherness of God, and moving forward to see how that transformation will change us, will bring us together, will take the walls down and build bridges to each other. And I think this gospel, this invitation, is more timely than ever, not just in this city or in this continent, but also in the old Europe continent where I come from, and in the post-Brexit dilemma of Britain, which I suffer under, and in view of Le Pen and in all the European and North American nations, the new so-called patriotism, which is at the expense of many others. All forms of exclusion are in direct contradiction to that vocation of love, to build the world together with all people of goodwill. And as Christians, to make that contribution there, which allows us to say, come and see what we are contributing in terms of our invitation to be part and parcel of God's creation and reconciliation, which are two sides of the same coin. Thank you very much.